just going to kind of go over some terms, and so that the math when you get out there to do your pasture allocation is makes more sense, and you can get through it better. But I got to start with a couple quotes. Every blade of grass is a study, and to produce two where there was but one is both a profit and a pleasure. Anybody know who, except for the instructors now, anybody know who said that? Any guesses? It wasn't in this century, by the way. That was Abraham Lincoln said that. And that, like I said before, it's probably wasn't trying to impress anybody because it wasn't quite election year there. So 1859, it would have been more than a year before the next election. So they don't start their elections like they do now a year before it happens. I don't think so. They didn't at that time. Another quote here. I got to kind of set this one up. This was a guy. He had been on this place of his for 30 years when he wrote this article, and about 25 of that 30 years he had been trying to make a living with crops. And he had a neighbor next door who he talks about in this quote, who had grass that whole time, had raised livestock and kept it in grass, never broke it out. And so he at some point decided to change and try to do some stuff like his neighbor. And so this is a quote from this article. And I'm just going to read it because then I'll know we're all to the end of it when I get done. He and the mortgage fiend have long since parted company, and the preserved fertility of his soil is evidenced by the superior abundance of its yield and the absence of foul and noxious weeds. Besides, all along the line of his life he is in the constant enjoyment of that peace of mind which can come to the husbandman only from the contemplation of grassy fields, lowing and bleating flocks, and the knowledge of the fact that the wolf, that being the mortgage fiend, is far removed from his door. I'm not going to ask you who wrote this, but when do you think this was written? Approximately. Any ideas? Any guesses? That was written in 1889. It's in an article entitled Grass, and if anybody wants it, let me know. I can send it to them. But think about that. This guy started farming in eastern Nebraska in 1859, and he writes, I think, in this article, that when he came into the country, all the springs were flowing, all the creeks were running year long, and after just 25 years of farming entering that country, he said pretty much all the springs were dried up, and that's how much the change from grass to cropland had changed the hydrology in that area, and convinced him that having grass was a better way to go than farming, I guess. So thought that was it's an interesting article and a pretty impressive writing for that time and thought. So anyway, just kind of a primer there. The basics of feed and forage balance is essentially balancing the requirements of the animals, and so what the animals need on one side with what you have available for forage on the other side. And the key part of this, I left my grazing stick, but the key part of this equation is the animal unit part. And so essentially AUM basically means how much one animal unit will consume in a month. Okay, so that's and the other side, the AUE, that's the value compared to one animal unit, which is a 1,000-pound cow with a calf. So if you can balance those two sides, then you've got a feed and forage balance. All right, so gonna try to define a couple terms here, and the first thing we typically recommend is what we call take half, leave half, and emphasis on the leave half part. So if you noticed when that thing came off there, that wasn't quite by height, that wasn't halfway by height, but it's halfway by weight. So that at that point, basically that's half by weight. And so the term and what we're leaving there is critical to the plant in terms of carrying on photosynthesis and replenishing the roots. And at 50% by weight, which is kind of what that represents, there's really no measurable effect to the plant. So what they've done is they've done studies, and pretty much on grasses, anything over 50%, you start to have an effect on root growth. And since a grass plant has to replace at least 30%, well, let me put it this way, at least 30% of its roots naturally die off every year. They just slough off, and it's as high as 60%. So every year, those grasses are losing 30 to 60% of their roots, and they have to replace them. And so to do that, if you graze at kind of that take half, leave half level, you won't have any effect on the root growth, and they'll be able to replenish their roots every year. So that's pretty critical to the grass. That's a known level of grazing that really keeps the grasses healthy. So what we call that, if you measure that, you go out there and you measure what's left and actually measure the height of the remaining vegetation. That's called utilization. So it's a measurement of what's left compared to what you started with by weight. And in this case, again, it'd be 50% utilization. All right, so let's look at the other half now. And so the part that we took off, we're going to kind of define grazing or harvest efficiency on that part. So of that 50% that we removed, basically in a kind of an average rotation, let's say a 5 or 6 pasture rotation, maybe a couple weeks, maybe 3 weeks occupation period. In that kind of grazing rotation, basically what you can expect is half of what is the other half there goes to insects, trampling, or those darn careless cows. They just they're not real careful. No, but sometimes you'll see a cow will bite something off, and then they decide they don't like it, and they'll just spit it right back out again. So anyway, half of it goes to waste, and the other half actually goes into the livestock's belly. And what we call that then is the result is 25% grazing or harvest efficiency. So on this form, the sheet that's going to help you calculate the size of your paddocks, we talk about utilization, and we'll go through that in a minute here, how you measure that. And then we talk about grazing or harvest efficiency. So that 25% grazing efficiency is what actually gets into the animal's belly. There's 3 basic values that you need to determine when you're out there. And the first one, I've already mentioned it, is the grazing efficiency. So again, and it's right there on the sheet, it includes the take half, leave half, and 25% loss through trampling, manure, insects, etc. So what kind of grazing efficiency can you use? Well, in a more intensive grazing management system, you can probably go higher up to maybe that 40%, or maybe even 45%. But you can't really exceed 50%, because we're going to try to, in most cases, leave 50% of the grass there for the health of the grass. So as far as the grazing efficiency that you're going to use on this form, you can kind of go between 25 and 40, maybe as high as 45. But that's something you're going to have to decide based on your management objective that you're given and how intensive of management you think you're going to have. So like I said, normally, just on average, on rangeland, we kind of use 25% harvest efficiency. Pastures, we go a little higher because they're usually more intensive. But you have that decision-making capability out there. You get to decide what grazing efficiency you want to use. So that's one number you got to come up with. The next number you're going to need to come up with is the pounds per acre. What is the forage production out there in pounds per acre on an air-dry basis? And so there's 2 ways you can do this. And Rod, let's go ahead and hand out that grazing stick too. There's 2 ways you can do this. The first way is by clipping. So you're going to have some equipment in your bag, and there's a 1.92 square foot plot frame in the bag. You put that down and you clip the grass out of there. And it's pretty simple. I was going to bring my bag in and show you, but you'll see it. It's pretty simple. Lay the plot frame down. Make sure all the grasses that are rooted in there are in. The ones that are rooted out are out. Clip everything inside the hoop. all the way down to the ground surface, because you want to get the total production for this number. And the hoops that you're getting, actually, I forgot about that. The hoops that you're getting are going to be a smaller plot frame than this.
It's times 100, isn't it?
Yeah, it's times 100. So the ones you're getting in your equipment bag are 0.96. We usually use 1.92. But so if you write on that form right now, if you change that 50 to 100, I did forget about that. So the factor will be 100. So you take the grams that you clip times 100. That'll give you the pounds per acre. The percent air dry, you can decide that. There's a chart on the bottom to determine the percent air dry for different conditions of grass. And so you take it times the percent air dry, and you'll have a pounds per acre. The other way that you'll probably want to try it to determine production is with the grazing stick. And this is pretty simple. If you look at the handle end of this thing, where it says USDA NRCS up there, okay, it says estimated air dry, to the left of that it says estimated air dry weight in pounds per acre. Okay, and then it's got the plant community on the left column, and then it's got stand density, normal, and excellent. So the first thing you do is decide what kind of plant community you're on. For us, for the most part, we're going to be, if you flip the stick one over, it says cool season native. That's probably the one you're going to pick for where we're going to be today. Or there is a native mixed cool and warm. I guess that one would make more sense, because that's actually what we have out there. Okay. And then the stand density, you can decide that. If you flip it over one more, there's a footnote for stand density. It says refers to the relative closeness of the desirable plants. An excellent stand density will have a cover greater than 85% and be vigorous. I'm going to guess that we're somewhere right in the middle, right, probably about that 200 pounds per inch. So all you have to do is take the stick, and what I do is just kind of take 2 or 3 paces and stop, and then put the stick down and measure the height of the grass. And what you want to do is kind of measure the leaf height. Not if you have like with smooth brome, you have a little seed head sticking up. Don't measure the total height, but measure kind of the basic leaf height. Get an average height, and then multiply that times 200, and that'll be another way of coming up with production. And usually they come out pretty close between your clipping frame and your stick. But go ahead and do both methods and see what you guys come up with. And interestingly enough, I'm not sure if Hemingway is still in here, but we did, okay, yep. He did, I should say. He went out and collected a whole bunch of cover crop data and clipped it, and they did some forage analysis on it as well, and that data is available somewhere, I think. Anyway, it was kind of curious that basically the cover crops came out the same way, about 200 pounds per inch. So if you forget your stick somewhere and you don't have this table in front of you, as a rule of thumb, just figure 200 pounds per inch for whatever you're measuring, and that should be pretty close to it's a rough estimate for air dry production anyway. So use both those methods, compare them, and see what you come up with. The third number that you got to decide is your average animal weight. So you're going to have 2 or 3 animals out there, and you need to, as a group, come up with a consensus number on how much they weigh. And with those 3 numbers, you should be able to run through all this math. The rest of it should be pretty self-explanatory. Yeah, in NRCS, with clipping and all this stuff, we always use air dry. I know for rations and stuff, they use oven dry or dry matter basis. And there's about a 12% difference, but anyway, that's just the way we've always done it, I guess. So any questions on any more questions on any of that? There's, just so you know, and usually we do this outdoors, but there's some other additional information on your grazing stick that you can use, maybe not so much this week, but when you get home. If you determine what that forage production is, like I said, use 200 pounds per inch, or use that table. Start it, and then go down to the left-hand side of the stick. It says forage supply. Okay, so that's where you would start with this stick. just like I said, the scales, you have forage supply on one side, and flip the stick over, and then forage demand is the left-hand side of that scale. That's what the animals are going to require. If you figure out those two numbers, then you flip the stick one more time, you can figure out any of these other three numbers that you're going to need to know, either the pasture size, the grazing period, or the animal number. So usually you know two of the three, and you just, once you figure out the forage supply, the forage production, the animal demand, you can figure out any one of those other three things using these formulas, and they're pretty self-explanatory. And there's also a table in the middle. It says rotation, 180-day grazing period, and it's got number of pastures, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, 12, 16, and there's a grazing efficiency there. Depending on how intensive your management is, you can select a grazing efficiency off there to come up with a value. So the more intensive, the higher the number. It's kind of the way it goes.
By the way, my name is Voss, and I work with the Natural Resources Conservation Service out of Mitchell, rangeland management specialist. Hopefully when you all came in here this afternoon, come through the registration table, you picked up a series of handouts on utilization, black and white copies, and there should be covering 5 different species: western wheatgrass, crested wheatgrass, green needlegrass, big blue stem, and smooth brome. Hopefully everyone has that. If you don't, they should be on the table there. And what we're going to talk about right now is utilization, and 2 types of utilization methods that you can use. The first one here, these tables here were developed based off a chart that the NRCS uses based on relationship to the amount of vegetation or biomass that is removed, and looking at that percentage and how it equates to a percentage use. So for our first example, if you want to grab your western wheatgrass chart, and the way this works, the first thing you want to do when you go out to the field is find a plant, a key species plant. In our case here, it's western wheatgrass, but you want to find a plant that has not been grazed, and then find the height of that plant using perhaps your grazing stick here. All right. So for my example here, let's use 14 inches. All right. And then you go to your tables, and you'll find on the right-hand side, you come down and you find the table for 14 inches. All right. That will be the table that you will be using, because all your plants out there should be in an ungrazed situation about 14 inches. All right. So that's your reference plant. Okay. So now that you've determined what your ungrazed plant height is, then you can start looking at the other plants in your pasture, the ones that are grazed. And the way you do that is through a step method, taking every other step and finding that western wheatgrass plant that is grazed and looking at the height that remains on that plant and measuring its height. So if you take a couple steps and the western wheatgrass plant that has been grazed there is 11 inches, you go to that same table and you'll see that at 11 inches, that plant has been grazed and you've used about 6 to 20%. We don't know exactly how much, but it's in that range there. All right, so that's about how much utilization you've had on that plant. You take 2 more steps and you find another plant, and let's say that one was clipped down to 6 inches. All right, well, 6 inches is above 5, but below 8.5. So that one would fall in that 21 to 40% range. Okay, is everyone with me? Please stop me now. all right? So you do that for about 30 different plants, and you start to get a feel then for what your utilization is on western wheatgrass. And if you're out there, depending on your season of use, if you're out there in the spring, they may be grazing multiple cool season plants. Perhaps you have green needle out there. You could do the same thing using your table for green needle grass. Or if you have smooth brome in your plant community, you can do the same thing for smooth brome. If you're out there in the warm season window, and you have big blue stem in your plant community, you'd want to use the big blue stem chart, of course. So, okay, any questions on that? And you can use this during our exercise if you do so desire. Any questions on that? The other one I want to share with you looks like this, and you should have picked it up on your table as well. And works fairly similar to that, except there is on the right-hand side, there is a description for each use level, and you'd have to take your steps just like you did before, but for each plant, you'd want to categorize based on the narrative description of that use. So 0 to 5% says that the key species shows no evidence of grazing use or very little use. All right. 6 to 20% says that the key species has the appearance of very light grazing. Plants may be topped or slightly used. Maybe just the tips of the leaves or a little more than that, but just the tops of the leaves are coming off. Current seed stalks and young plants are little disturbed. For the 21 to 40%, the key species may be topped, skimmed, or grazed in patches. Between 60 and 80% of the current seed stalks remain intact, and most young plants are undamaged. And we won't read through all of those narrative descriptions of your percentage uses, but if you're using this particular method, you would want to become familiar with that. And so that when you run your tests then, you would fill in your data under the dot count column in our example, and there is an example there that's filled in, and then there's a blank sheet on the back. I should have explained that. But if you look at our example one that's filled out, they're using the dot count method, which is simply putting a dot in the respective category for the use level. And you run that on however many plants you want to. In our example here, they did it on 30 of them. 30 different plants. And then for each use level, you would take the midpoint interval, multiply it by the number of hits that you got in each utilization level to come up with your midpoint. Okay, I'm getting some looks there. All right. Here's your dot count column. Everyone with me? So this person here found 3 plants that fell into that 0 to 5%. All right. The one below it at 6 to 20%, they found actually 6 of them there. All right.
How do you know 6?
They use those little dots. Each dot represents one plant, and then they come back with a line and tie 2 dots together, and each line represents a plant. And actually, if you go down and you'll see the 21 to 40% one, there's like a box with 2 X's in it. That equals 10. So it's just a way of keeping track of how many plants you've calculated. You can also do hash mark 4 with a line through it. You know, that's pretty standard, 4 with a line through it. If you want to do that, that's all right. We don't want to get lost in that, but it's just a method of tallying up your hits. So you multiply, let's go back to our top one then, where they got 3 hits. Our midpoint level, which is at 2.5 times 3 equals 7.5. and they've calculated that for us there. If you sum the end of your last column, which is the C times M, all the way down, we come up with 855.5. If you divide that by the total number of plants you looked at, again, we looked at 30 plants, that comes up with your use percent, which is 28% use. Okay? Everyone follow that now? Please ask now if you don't. Yeah.
What is the interval midpoint? Where did that come from?
Your interval midpoint is simply the midpoint between, in this case, 0 and 5. Halfway between 0 and 5 is 2.5. The halfway point between 6 and 20 is 13. All right. Okay. And what's nice about this this data sheet is you can track 2 species. In our example here, they tracked western wheatgrass and needle and thread. All right. So if you flip it over, like I say, you have a blank one that you can use out in the field. For either method, like I say, these are just 2 methods for determining utilization. Either one's acceptable and will be useful for your exercise this week.